Welcome back, everyone, to our final session at the Centre for Progressive Policy's Inclusive Growth Conference. Remember, if you're on Zoom, you can ask questions via the question and answer function. We're also live streaming on Facebook Live and also on the website via YouTube. And you can also find us on Twitter. The hashtag is IGConf2021. Do join us there if you'd like to. Now, for this final session, we're going to peer into the crystal ball a little bit and consider what levelling up could mean in the long run. How do successive governments go about achieving a healthier, green and inclusive future? And as part of that conversation, we have the launch of a joint APPG statement from the Inclusive Growth and Left Behind Neighbourhoods, APPGs. I'm not going to say any more because I have the experts beside me. I'll let our speakers give you the detail. Let me introduce them all. Liam Byrne is the Labour MP for Hodge Hill and co-chair of the APPG for Inclusive Growth. And they've actually been working with the CPP on some key ideas. And of course, we'll hear more about that in just a moment. Paul Howell is the Conservative MP for Sedgefield, and he's co-chair of the APPG for Left Behind Neighbourhoods. And he, in turn, has been working with our next speaker, Margaret Bolton. She's the Director of Policy and Communications at Local Trust. She has a background in policy, research, public affairs and communications. And last and definitely not least is Charlotte Aldrett, Director of CPP. Let's begin, first of all, by turning to you, Liam Byrne.
Thanks. Well, delighted to be here. We're very proud to be CPP's parliamentary wing and very proud to be working together with the APPG on Left Behind Neighbourhoods. So as we head into budget week, you know, the big question is how do we stop now a pandemic of disease becoming a pandemic of poverty? Last week at the IMF annual meetings, we heard that global output's been hit by about 17 trillion. But worse could lie ahead because the crisis isn't over, and bad decisions now could cost the world economy another 5 trillion in lost output. And what's true of the world is true of the UK. And so we've put our heads together to think, right, what does levelling up need to mean over the next few years, and crucially over the next few days as we head into budget week. Now, if I go back 10 years to the great financial crisis, when we were putting our fiscal consolidation plan together, we worried about nurturing growth, we worried about avoiding a double dip recession, we worried about not increasing inequality. You know, we think that a number of mistakes were made after us and we've got to learn from that experience. And so that's why there are sort of 3 or 4 big ideas in the joint statement that we've launched today. So the first is education. There is no social mobility, there's no equality without education. And some of you will have seen the IFS work that showed this £6,500 gap between how much is now spent on a state school student and how much is spent on a private school student. To close that gap nationally would cost us £55 billion. Now, it's possible that we see that money on the table next week, but I doubt it. And that's why we say, look, a good first step would be to significantly increase the pupil premium in places that really need it. Second, health. You know, this is a crisis that is not over. You know, the vaccination rates in our poorest wards in Birmingham are 1/3 the level of the richest wards. And we know that there is a pandemic of mental health that has been really building up now. Yesterday, Duchess of Cambridge launched a fantastic action against addiction campaign, which is an important part of it. We now need government to do their bit. And so making sure that we are protecting community health services, often on the front line. And remember, there could be, the estimates are there's going to be 10.5 million new cases of mental health treatment needed over the next few years. Safeguarding community health services and public health budgets, absolutely critical. Final piece of the puzzle then for us is place. Some places have been hit a hell of a lot harder than others. And, you know, we do now at least have a government that believes in a creative state. We're delighted that our former co-chair, George Freeman, is now helping lead that charge as a government minister. But, you know, creative states aren't centralised states. And in many ways, we have one of the most centralised administrations that we've had for a long time now. The irony is Friedrich Hayek would be turning in his grave at the approach that is being taken to industrial policy at the moment. And that's why we need radical devolution of funding flexibility to local areas. Let's start by putting the Prosperity Fund, the National Skills Retraining Fund. There's a bunch of other funds in the apprenticeship budget, the adult education budget. Let's start putting them into one pot, devolving them and giving local areas the chance to actually flex the spending to their needs. So we've got 10,500 days now between the pandemic and the deadlines of the Paris Agreement. It is probably the most complex set of policy challenges as we try and hold down temperature and wind back inequality. And that's why conferences like this and the work of Local Trust and CPP are so absolutely critical.
Thanks very much. That's a great basis for the conversation we're going to have. Paul Howell, I'm going to let you build on that a bit.
Thanks. I mean, I'd like to take it from the actual work that the APPG are doing. I'm going to make some, opening remarks really that are about what levelling up should do for these neighbourhoods and how this joint statement should contribute to driving real lasting change. Really, I'm committed to cross-party working to try and address these challenges. Our APPG was set up in July last year with Local Trust, and again, I would commend them for the work that they've done throughout this process. And, it's important that we work with colleagues from across the country, from across the parties and across the two houses. It's important that we get a complete picture on this. But also, and it's what we've done in our APG, I'm sure it's the same in yours, that we need to include the community organisations that are doing so much in their amazing work day in, day out to improve people's lives. And we've got to develop and support those practical policy solutions that help to improve the outcomes for citizens who face considerable difficulties and disadvantages just because of where they live. And we know the foundational research that Local Trust have done for us, there's 225 deprived wards with high levels of community need, and that people are experiencing a disadvantage just because they live there. There are often areas on the periphery. They're often, in my particular patch, they're ex-mining villages, but they're also around the outsides of major towns. There's coastal estates. There's a variety of different ones. I've got 3 in my patch, but they're throughout the country. It's not a north-south game. It's bigger than that. And what we've found is that the challenges are so different. We know that these areas have such low levels of social infrastructure, which is essential. If you need to build social capital, you've got to have some social infrastructure. We know that they're lacking in resilience. When COVID struck, not only were these communities more exposed to the pandemics due to higher levels of clinical vulnerability, they had lower concentrations of mutual aid groups. They were considerably less successful in getting money from charitable organisations. They didn't have people there who had the capacity to do things. So for me and our APPG, levelling up has to help address the range of challenges faced by residents in these neighbourhoods, whether that's economic, social, environmental, health and well-being. It has to help improve outcomes for the people that live there, from educational attainment, driving up skills and improving the health and well-being. And to do this, we need a strategic, long-term, targeted approach to improving local outcomes across these policy areas. And the approach to levelling up has to fully involve local people. It has to be led by the local communities. One of the phrases we've used regularly, Margaret, is it has to be done with the people, not to the people. That's just fundamental for this to achieve anything. So we've got to start by investing in people that live in the community, to build that community's capacity and confidence so that the community itself can be the key player in this levelling up process. Levelling up can't simply be a top-down government project. If it isn't about levelling up from the bottom up, it won't work. Levelling up also can't simply be about investing in big-ticket physical infrastructure, important though that is. Because if it is, it just won't touch the people that need it most. And that's why it's investment in the grassroots over the long term that will contribute to driving real and sustainable change. And that's what we mean by levelling up the left behind. It's about investing in people, their capacity, their skills, and building confidence at the end of the day. They need to have hope. I mean, I talked before, in my patch, I want a new railway station in Ferry Hill. Why? Because that will bring hope to the people that live around there, that people care, and that, it's not just the physical engagement of the transport infrastructure, it's actually the ability to think, actually, the powers that be think about them, whether that's the local authority or whether it's the government. You're trying to get that belief and hope. I think I've used the phrase before about we want people to have a perspective that the glass is half full rather than half empty. I think there's another phrase I heard last week. I think it might even have been one of the debates with Sir David earlier, that you've got to be able to have a glass that's refillable. You've got to be able to put that hope back in when things change. So I really welcome the recommendations of the joint statement. The key policy objective of a community wealth fund to invest in the essential building blocks of social infrastructure in these communities that don't have many of the things that most of us take for granted. It's just fundamental to me. If we're to ensure that the most left behind neighbourhoods are best prepared to overcome the challenges of a climate changing world and avoid a repeat of the damage caused by previous economic restructuring, we must give them greater power and control over what happens locally. That's why I'm really supportive of the statement, and I'll be championing these and other recommendations as we go forward. I think the final point to make in terms of the climate agenda, one of the things we found in our last report, just to conclude, was that sometimes getting the message of people doing the right thing, i.e. insulating their house because it'll take their bill down, actually also has the knock-on effect that it helps the climate. And it's about how we get the messaging in to make people take actions that affect their lives and make it move forward.
Lots of interesting thoughts there. And a refillable cup would, of course, be a green cup, so that'd be a good thing. Margaret, over to you.
Exactly.
Great. So elaborating on some of the things that Paul said, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we've learnt at Local Trust from nearly 10 years experience supporting deprived communities to improve their neighbourhoods, and how that relates to the approach that government's currently taking to levelling up. One thing that's crystal clear to us, and Paul's already mentioned this, is the importance of investing in social as well as hard economic infrastructure. And by social infrastructure, I think we mean particularly spaces and places to meet. We mean community organisations and activities. And for us, those are important because they help to ensure that residents have a strong network of support. They bolster health and they smooth access to work and training. Research that we've commissioned, which as Paul has already said, was the foundational research for the APPG for Left Behind Neighbourhoods, shows that residents in council wards that are not only severely deprived, but also lack this infrastructure have markedly worse socio-economic outcomes. And that's across all metrics. So it's employment, it's health, it's education. And even before the pandemic, the gap was actually widening between those communities and others. So we need to invest in social infrastructure, but our view is that we also need to do it in the right way. So we actually have a recipe for levelling up, and it has 5 ingredients. It's not currently part of the government's cookbook, but we'd like to get it written in. So first, we think it's crucially important that we invest at the neighbourhood level, and that's starting with the communities who are the most deprived or left behind. Second, this funding should not be awarded through a competitive process. It should go direct to those communities. And that's actually because they're the communities that lack the knowledge and skills to be able to fundraise successfully. And so, if we don't move away from competitive processes, they're never going to access funds, and they're never going to be able to catch up, and they'll fall further and further behind. Third, again, as Paul has said, we should trust the residents of these neighbourhoods to know how the cash could best be spent. And I think that's for a number of reasons. I think it's because if projects are developed by local people, they tend to have a lot more traction, they achieve better outcomes, And that approach actually builds capacity in communities, and it also seeds the development of local institutions which can leave a lasting and sustainable legacy. Fourth, investment needs to be long-term. And by that, I think, we're talking about 10 to 15 years. And that's basically because that's what you need to actually build capacity in communities, and also to seed those institutions that I was talking about. I think, though, that an important thing to say is the investment can be very small scale relative to what we're investing in economic infrastructure. And then finally, fifth, communities need to be mentored or otherwise supported to ensure that the cash is well spent, but also to ensure that communities don't burn out. This may seem pie in the sky, to continue the cooking metaphor, but Big Local, which is the programme that Local Trust administers, is based on those 5 principles. And we would argue that it demonstrates how such an approach can be transformational. So the programme awarded 1 million to each of 150 communities in 2012, and Local Trust has been supporting those communities to spend that money since. And I guess to illustrate this point about how the investment can be transformational, I wanted very quickly to give you just one example of a Big Local area. So Lawrence Weston Big Local serves a housing estate on the edge of North Bristol, which suffers from severe unemployment, also child poverty. And the community have used their Big Local money on a wide range of projects to improve the estate. And they've used it to leverage in millions in external funding. So, for example, they conducted some market research that persuaded a low-cost supermarket to locate to the area. That brought local jobs. It also provided access to cheaper food for the residents of the estate. They're also working with the public sector to develop a 1.8 million health and community hub. They've also developed passive housing and a solar farm, and they have planning permission for the country's largest wind turbine. So that's really just to scratch the surface of what they've achieved, but it gives you a flavour of what's possible. And just to finish, I think that's why our proposal for a community wealth fund is crucially important, because that would enable the same sort of investment in communities going forward. And we really welcome the fact that the Community Wealth Fund is recommended in the joint statement by the APPG for Left Behind Neighbourhoods and the APPG for Inclusive Growth. So, we'd like to thank you very much for that. Thank you.
That's great. This theme of local has been a very big one today. Charlotte, I'm going to let you comment on what's been said and perhaps tie up some of those threads too.
Thank you. So I'm not going to add too much, but I'm just going to reflect on some of the themes you say, Rita, that we've heard this afternoon. And I commented earlier that I've been really struck by the degree of consensus there is around this push to do things locally. And there's a huge amount of consensus around the need for an appropriate net zero strategy. We're waiting for this, like manna from heaven, what is levelling up, and the white paper and the SR that's going to fall behind that and really help us to deliver the kind of change that we're talking about, tackling inequality, tackling entrenched deprivation, supporting so-called left behind communities, and seeing a step change in the kinds of things we want to see around a healthier, greener and fairer economy. There's a huge amount of consensus in the policy community and in the media, in the wider commentariat. But this needs to translate into action on the ground. It needs to be driven by a shared mission at that national level, but a recognition of the role of local in delivering that. At CPP, as I said earlier, We run our inclusive growth network of 12 places across the UK that are pioneering ways to push ahead on clean, inclusive growth. And together, with cross-party leadership, cross-party engagement, cross-party working of the kind that we're exhibiting today with the launch of our statement, as well as getting those resources and policy levers all working in the same direction, I feel quite optimistic, we were talking about at the beginning, as to the fact that we can affect change. And we can affect change because we are seeing it on the ground already, the kind of examples that you talked about through local trust. But the other thing that I just wanted to highlight is that I think whilst we can get excited about policy documents and all the rest, particularly in the kind of Westminster bubble, I think we need some humility and a recognition of when we need to step back and examine our own systems and processes and identify when they aren't necessarily working for the objectives that we're trying to pursue. And there was a brilliant paper that you published, Local Trust, that identified where local government, for example, could be as much part of the problem as it can be part of the solution. And that applies to any kind of institution, whether we're talking about the NHS, whether we're talking about central government, whether we're talking about any of our public, private, civic institutions. And I think that sense of what a shared national mission is, and the humility to really get under the bonnet of how we address and deliver that collectively has to be the next step. So we're really looking forward to the various government announcements over next week. COP26 is a huge kind of global event and a global milestone that we're going to need to hit. But I think the thing that I take away and the thing that we strive to do at CPP is to work with partners to really make it happen. And I think that's going to require a deep level of system change that I don't think we're quite geared up to yet acknowledge, let alone realise. But there are seeds of change, and there are green shoots that make me feel positive that we will make it happen, because we have to.
Some great thoughts there, and it's good to have some positivity and some great examples as well from Margaret, but I'm afraid I'm going to be the voice of cynicism, as you'd expect. Paul and Liam, it's been sweetness and light from the two of you, all this cross-party consensus working together, but is it actually going to happen? How far can you push this beyond, obviously the good relationships you have within APPGs, between APPGs? Paul, I mean, are the higher-ups in your party actually going to listen?
I hope so. I've just, like we all have, we've just come from conference season. One of the things that happened at the Conservative Party conference was a leaflet was put out by myself and a number of other colleagues. It was about a dozen of us that put it out, which was all about trusting the people. And that was about just making sure, it goes back to a little bit of what Liam was saying in terms of place. That it's about investing in place, and maybe that's a comprehensive investment and to use what Margaret was saying, it's a patient investment. It's something that takes place over time. And I've absolutely endorsed, that document that was produced there. I know, because I was at one of the sessions there, that Michael Gove was on the table, that was discussing the presentation of this document, and I'm sure we didn't agree with everything that was in it, but there was a lot of consensus to what was put out there that he seemed to be very supportive of. So I'm very optimistic that amongst others, he will drive that agenda forward.
So Liam, from your point of view, how do you drive that agenda forward? How do you turn this paper into something real?
I think you've really got to push with some real case studies to exemplify the problem. So if I take the big local area in my constituency, Bromford and Hodge Hill, that I fought for nearly 10 years ago now, a couple of messages really stand out. One, it has got to be long term, because things go wrong, and actually you need time for people to kind of recover. Two, you need a lot tighter integration with people who have actually gone to the trouble of standing for an election. Sometimes that has not always worked well. But, I also fought on this estate to get an £8 million health centre. We could not get that health centre open to community groups because it was built with an NHS lift contract that meant that the rent on the health centre was so high, you could never get a community group in there. We have the highest rate of child poverty in the country in my constituency, in part because wage rates are so low. You need 2 parents in work in East Birmingham if you are to earn above the poverty line. There is no childcare, and nor are there resources to put childcare in place on the Bromford estate. When we were redeveloping the homes, how hard do you think it was to get Western Power to move the transformer so that we could bring 2 blocks down, put in 300 new houses that we want to pioneer retrofitting? Absolutely impossible, because we've got no local power to do it. So, very often it is these kind of intractable barriers because local areas don't have the power and the resources to put it in place. We know that the thing that could make the most jobs fastest would be 2 business improvement districts. They've got a great record for increasing employment. How many officers do you think we can hire to push through a business improvement district in East Birmingham? We have no power or resources to put. So I'm having to do half the work. So you've just got these kind of chasms between the kind of the theory and the practice, and unless you can find a way of getting the power and the money at that local level, as was described, you ain't going to move it forward.
I am going to come to questions from people listening and watching in a moment. But Margaret, just building on that then, how frustrated are you by the political cycle, if you like? I mean, we're already starting to talk about the next election. For you, who clearly you believe in long-term projects, the need for these, I think you said 10 to 15 years. How do you feel about that? How does it work alongside the work that you're doing? It's our democratic process.
Well, it is frustrating, given that we're all agreed that there's a need for 10, 15 years of investment, a commitment to that length of time, when that just doesn't work with political cycles. And, I think there's quite a lot of evidence with the existing levelling up funds that they're really about shovel-ready projects. And not to want to sound too cynical myself, but they're geared at trying to make a difference before the next election. Whereas if we want to build back better, if we genuinely want to level up, we do really need to take that very long-term view. But to be frank, that's why with our Community Wealth Fund proposal, we're suggesting that could be funded from dormant assets.
Such as?
Things like bonds, stock, shares, insurance policies. And there's actually legislation in Parliament at the moment to release a wider range of dormant assets for good causes. And that's the money that we think could be made available to set up a community wealth fund, and that it should be an independent endowment. And that takes it, out of the political cycle in terms of funding.
One other brief question, a detail from what you were talking about devolving or giving out levelling up funds. You talked about the need that there should be no competitive process. But then who decides who gets the funds? How do you decide?
You decide based on need. So you decide based on data. So you look at which are the areas that are most severely deprived. You might also we would argue you should look at which are the areas that are most lacking in social infrastructure, given those are the ones that that have the worst outcomes, markedly worse outcomes.
I'm going to go to a question from Tony Smith, who's watching via Zoom. He says, 20 years ago, we started some approaches to levelling up local places, which took on board many of the points made by the speakers. New Deal for communities, neighbourhood renewal and neighbourhood management. Do the panel think the government could learn from those initiatives? Liam?
Absolutely. I mean, we went through this cycle, at the end of the 90s, and the neighbourhood renewal strategy in particular, creating floor targets for each ward was supremely important. But, I'm surprised actually Tony has missed this out from his question, because actually the final piece of the puzzle was an initiative called Total Place, which allowed you to basically pool all of the public sector spending in a particular geography and say, right, let's put all of that in one pot. And that would get round your problem with, you can't open the health centre because it's too expensive. You can actually hire the people to move the power transformer. And it's going to be more and more important now with things like retrofitting. So, in the West Midlands, we need to retrofit 156 homes a day between now and 2035 to hit our net zero targets. Now, you can't do that by just handing out green grants to individual homes. You've got to take, a block by block, street by street approach. But because of the cost, you're going to have to find ways of leveraging lots of different bits of public money. So we can absolutely learn about that. I think you can learn a lot from big local. But at the end of the day, money is the root of all progress. And
so Paul, are we just reinventing the wheel then in this conversation?
It's difficult for me to say. I mean, I'm not an experienced politician. I've been in this job since 2019. I've been a councillor since 2016.
It's a very political answer, if I may say.
I don't have the depth of knowledge that Liam has on those particular things. But clearly, we all know that initiatives come round, but they've got to make a difference. They've got to actually get through the stage of doing things. And I know, sometimes things happen with what might seem good intent and actually don't come out with the results that you want them to. We know about, in times when, local authorities have transferred community centres to local people. But I've heard that described not as an asset transfer, but as a liability transfer. Yeah. And what's happening is the people who are doing the work as volunteers are spending too much time trying to finance the building instead of doing the volunteering work that they want to do.
Yeah.
So we've got to find a way through that. And that's why this is why this sort of funding initiative is something that I'm very happy and delighted to get behind in terms of trying to do something about. I can't comment on the history.
So just then something that you probably do have a view on in terms of then how we make the most of this moment, which is also something we've talked about quite a bit today. How can you ensure that this commitment to building back better actually outlasts the pandemic? That in a year and a half's time, when we're worrying about, rising gas and oil prices and rising inflation, this isn't all forgotten.
That's about the integrity of us in the House and making sure that we do push things through as to where they are, and that we don't jump from one agenda to the next, that we actually stick to it. I mean, one of the things that almost frustrated me, it was because of timing and where you were, but the very first report we did in the Left Behind Neighbourhoods thing was about the impact of COVID, because COVID got here before we could do anything else.
Yes.
And it was really important to me that we didn't turn it into a COVID agenda, because the whole ethos of doing Left Behind Neighbourhoods was there before COVID came. And it's a longer term thing than that. It's a longer term initiative than that. It's about, yes, it's had an impact, of course it has. It's had an impact, and it's a disproportionate impact on particularly the communities that we've looked at here. But the gaps in society were already there, and we need to do something about them.
And I think the politics of it, I mean, Boris Johnson has got a job to do for Paul, which is to, help Paul get re-elected. And, and therefore, at the end of the day, the amount of the electorate that is now tribally one party or another is at the lowest level ever. So, we're living in a time now where the electorate is more volatile than ever before, and therefore up for grabs in that sense. And frankly, if you can't deliver on your promises, then actually, we're not going to last long in office. So I think actually the politics of this do point in a particular direction.
Sorry, just to build on that point slightly, that's one of the frustrations, though, isn't it? That it's too easy to become, a 2, 3, 4, 5-year agenda, as opposed to what we've seen in some of our sessions, where some of these things actually need to be 15, 20-year agendas, and we need to embed them in the longer term. Sorry,
no, Charlotte, I was going to bring you in, because I imagine this is something that concerns you as a policy thinker, policy maker.
Well, I mean, just to state the obvious, really. I mean, political cycles can disrupt, but, we still want to hold on to our democratic institutions and practices and all the rest. And I think that's healthy. But I think, as Paul was saying, it's about the integrity of Parliament to maintain focus on the things that really matter. And I think if it's not clean, inclusive growth, building a more resilient, healthier population, then what is our industry and public policy and politics all about? Call it levelling up, call it whatever you like. That's what it has to come back to. And I think, Jim O'Neill this morning talked about kind of political squabbles even within parties. So Theresa May refusing to mention the Northern Powerhouse Partnership because it happened to be a kind of Osborne invention. So I think it's not just cross-party, it's within party as well. And if I could finally just come back to Tony's question, I think the other thing, and I'm mindful of at CPP, particularly the emphasis that we put on investment in social infrastructure, health, education, the role of place, as Liam was talking about, that form the kind of mainstay of this joint statement. I think we have to look back at programmes such as New Deal for Communities, Neighbourhood Renewal and others. By the way, I think total place is the key to freedom, so I would be pushing that. But I think we need to ask ourselves why they didn't necessarily shift the dial to the extent that we are demanding now. What can we learn that went wrong or didn't work as well as we would like, as much as one of the principles?
Well, I think the key thing is the emphasis you put on social infrastructure. So, I remember in the latter stages of New Deal of Communities, because most of the money was capital, it was easier to get investment in new bollards than it was in retraining. And actually, the way I brought unemployment down in Kitts Green was not through bollards. I needed retraining budgets. And so the emphasis that you put in the statement, I think, on education, on social infrastructure, on childcare, that is the key lesson to learn from the past. Now, that does have implications, because it does mean that we need to start thinking about, well, what are the rights that people should have to good childcare, to a good education, to good police services, to catch-up services at school. We concluded at the end of the Labour government that we needed to take the 167 performance indicators that we had for running Whitehall and boil it down into 10 core rights. And actually, that's where I think this statement could go next, in terms of just teasing out, right, what are the rights of a citizen of Birmingham on the Bromford estate to childcare, schooling, public safety, etc. That's where I think we could take it.
And an evolution of that, as we've alluded to all this afternoon, is around kind of Treasury and Whitehall departments kind of reflecting back, as I said before, where they themselves are a barrier to effecting change. And it's that kind of getting locked in orthodoxies that don't allow you to think about new approaches to accounting for resource spend versus capital. These are the kind of things that get in the way of progress.
I know everybody wants to come in. I want to bring in Margaret for a moment. Margaret, comment on that by all means. I'm just going to give you an extra little bit to chew on. Spending review next week. We've hacked into the Treasury's computers. I mean, how would you prioritise?
Well, could I come back?
Of course, yes, go on.
That's okay. So we've commissioned quite a lot of research, looking at past regen initiatives, and basically the message from that research is that where previous regeneration schemes have given communities power and control over resources, they've tended to be more successful. In areas where there's been investment in foundational social infrastructure, initiatives have had a more significant and a more sustained impact. So echoing many of the things that other people on the panel have said, those two things seem to be, crucially important in terms of levelling up and how government develops its agenda. And sorry, Rick, I've forgotten.
I was just saying, in terms of the conversation we've just been having about actually keeping these changes going and where the priorities lie. I mean, if you could get your hands on that spending review, where would you put the money?
I would put the money into a local area, or some of the money into a local area initiative, because we've had investment that's about towns, we've had investment that's about high streets, we've had investment that's broadly about hard physical infrastructure, but we haven't as yet had revenue investment, in communities.
Mm. Paul, sorry, you wanted to come in earlier.
Yeah, no, I was just picking up on what Charlotte said, really, in terms of, Treasury and accounting and all of this sort of thing. My history before this place was, I'm an accountant by trade, so I get the difference between capital and revenue. But one of the discussions we had at one of the seminars was the fact that, getting capital spend is sometimes easier than getting revenue spend. Well, if you invest in training, is that capital or should it be capital when in actual fact it goes as revenue?
Yeah.
You know, it's an investment in a short-term fixed period of time. And I think there is, you know, the opportunity to try and look at that space a little differently to where we have in the past.
It's often easier to raise money for buildings than it is for people because you can see the building. But being realistic, Liam, it's likely that there will be fiscal tightening in a few weeks' time, or we're going to learn about it. There's not, you know, the Chancellor's made it quite clear that money is not going to be sprayed about in perhaps the way it has been during the pandemic. What do you think will happen to the budgets that you're discussing? Won't the situation get tighter before it gets better?
Yeah, I fear the worst. It's as simple as that. I mean, the path that Rishi has set himself is pretty aggressive, and funnily enough, I mean, it's not something the IMF are recommending. You know, the IMF are very clear that now is not the time to be raising taxes. They're very clear that there needs to be a social recovery. They really understand at an international level what the damage is to education and in health systems. I mean, you think, I have head teachers in Hodge Hill tell me that kids coming back into school, into reception now, you know, they will often forgotten the norms of eating at a table with a knife and fork. There will be kids that have, you know, lost the art of toilet training, you know, and when you really push head teachers on how far behind or how much time they think children have lost, many are saying 2 to 3 years. That's the multiplier effect of the education that they've lost. So, you know, it's why we put such an emphasis on pupil premium. We're not going to find £55 billion to equalise public and private education. But we could make sure that children who have had their education knocked sideways do get some catch up.
Paul, how do you persuade the government to take perhaps a longer term view?
Well, I think that it's one of the challenges and has been ad infinitum for every government every time. But I think that you know, we've got a completely different profile in the Conservative backbenchers these days to what we've had for forever, probably. And I think the opportunity there is for my colleagues on the backbenchers, to make sure that we do push for the things that we see as being a longer term investment for our communities. And I would endorse what Liam just said. I've been around schools and had exactly that conversation. You know, sometimes it's you know, you go in as a non-educationalist. As a non-educationalist, and you're expecting the challenged children to be the young people who are just sitting exams and all of this sort of thing. But actually, it's the foundational levels where it seems to be having the biggest impact from what the heads are telling me. Yeah, I'd agree.
I'm going to bring in a question from Richard Nelson, who's watching on Zoom. He says, levelling up, originating from the bottom up, is the right way. Even guidance from the top is suspect, let alone programming. Is this going to be policy? I'm not quite sure I know what that means, but Charlotte, are we saying, I think what Richard's saying is levelling up going to be policy? Is it going to be allowed to be from the bottom up as opposed to from the top down? That's how I'm going to interpret it.
Well, I think first of all, it's worth saying that I think levelling up as a policy is to do it a disservice, because that would imply that it's, you know, a singular, you know, levelling up fund, as we saw in the March budget, for example, or that the white paper that we're looking forward to is somehow going to be you know, that cliched silver bullet, and that's the policy. You know, what we're talking about here is something that goes much bigger than a single kind of policy announcement. It is about a deeper systemic change that has to be underpinned by bottom-up engagement and delivery, to use kind of Whitehall speak. I think the idea of guidance from the top, if that is that shared national mission that brings in the role of business, and, you know, 12 months ago we heard a terrific statement from the, you know, UK leading business leaders around their commitment to build back better from the pandemic. If that kind of shared mission, public and private sector, is guidance from the top, then actually I welcome it, because I think that is going to galvanise the real change that we need. But levelling up needs to be more than a policy. It needs to be something that is systemic across our institutions, across our government departments, and right down to, you know, the kind of local trust grassroots end of the spectrum.
You have to ask, we're going to move to a point quite soon where we have to answer the question, what are we levelling up? So if you're born in the poorest group at the moment in Britain, it will take your family 5 generations just to get to average wage. How are you going to level that up? There's an 8-year gap in life expectancy between Sutton Coldfield and Aston. Are we going to level that up? The police response in East Birmingham is far slower than it is in other parts of the region. Are we going to level that up? So, what are the equalities, basically, that we're seeking to deliver? We invented rights in this country. We wrote the European Convention on Human Rights. We are, going back to Magna Carta. We've got this tradition. The Magna Carta has got a great deal to say about fish weirs, but not a lot to say about digital literacy. So actually just thinking about what are the rights that we want to level up for all citizens of this country has got to be where this goes next. And if there's a national framework for that, great. Delivering on that needs to be a local idea.
Paul, I mean, you could argue it was a slogan in search of a policy, and that policy we're told is coming. Does it matter to you whether it's top down, bottom up?
To be frank, no. To me, it's a bit. I hate to agree so violently, but it's levelling up will mean so much to so many different people. If you haven't got a job and there's job opportunities created, then it'll mean something to you. If you've got antisocial behaviour in your neighbourhood and that's being dealt with, then it'll mean something to you. There's two completely different examples to the sort of things that'll mean if your life gets better. It goes back to that analogy earlier about the wine glass. If the glass has suddenly become half full instead of half empty, then you're in a better place. But it's one of those things that it can be easily described or pulled apart as a rhetoric if the actual things that are delivered haven't been on the specific things that you thought it was part of. So the challenge in my eyes is for, and I think it's probably going to fall particularly on Michael Gove's desk, is to get something that is understandable, comprehensible, and people can see that this is what's being delivered and this is the route that we're going along, with a vision to deliver something over a period of time. And we need to see things happening quickly so that people can believe in, it's like the proverbial Titanic, it is. You've got to turn it and move it and get the big ball moving. Once it's moving, then we can try and gather pace, but you've got to start it moving in the first place.
We're almost out of time. Margaret, I'll let you give your thoughts. Bottom up, top down.
Well, I'm sorry to disagree with you, Paul, but it'd be very boring if we always agreed on everything. But
it's me and him that's supposed to disagree.
But I meant the panel.
Yes.
But I guess from my perspective, I think it's really important that it's bottom up. And that comes back to what I was saying about, it's the people in left behind or really deprived neighbourhoods that know best about what needs to happen in their area. And, I think that could be regarded as quite a radical proposition. But, if you think about it logically, what makes us think that politicians and bureaucrats in Whitehall know what's best for the people of Lawrence Weston, for example? It's the people who live on that estate in North Bristol for whom the stakes are really high, around these political and funding decisions that are made. So I think we should place more onus on them and their views.
No, I've just got to come back on exactly that point. That, the thing we said earlier, and we've said it consistently, Margaret, we're both on exactly the same page. It's about doing it with people. So it's the people at the top doing it with the people at the bottom. Whoever starts the discussion, I don't care, but it's got to be a joined up discussion.
But I think we can't underestimate the challenge of building the social capital in the first place. And, I'm afraid the nature of our housing market today, I have 4 wards where, when I look at the electoral register each year, there is a 20% turnover on the electoral register. So just the nature of the housing market today, and in many of those streets now we have HMOs or exempt accommodation where the social capital is basically evaporating each year at a faster pace at which we're able to build it. And actually, that was one of the big struggles for the big local on the Bromford and Firs estate. It took 5 to 6 years before we could really start bringing a coherent group of people together to act as that kind of glue. And that's just because we're swimming against a stream that is moving against it sort of quite quickly.
I'm going to stop you there, I'm afraid, because I've already crashed book at bedtime. It is time for us to wrap up. Thank you so much to the panel, to Liam, to Paul, to Margaret and to Charlotte. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. It has been inspiring and insightful, and lots of themes I think that have cropped up. We've talked a lot about the importance of the local. We've talked about growth, cooperation, imagination and resilience. All of these ideas have come up. If you want more, CPP is launching a podcast. There's more competition. I shouldn't be plugging this, should I? They're launching a podcast. You can access it via the website. It's there now. The Inclusive Growth Podcast. You can also get it on your regular podcast providers, Acast or I don't know, where else do we find them? Apple, Spotify, wherever you go. It's there. Subscribe. And remember, today's sessions will also be available on the website. So please do take a look. Also subscribe to the CPP newsletter because you'll find out more about upcoming events, and it will be lovely to have you with the CPP more regularly. But for now, thank you very much to our host, to Charlotte and everybody from the CPP, to all our speakers and to all of you for watching.